Our Father prayer proves that the Eucharist is the real flesh and blood of Christ.
All right, let's see it.
Now, what I'm about to share with you is absolutely crazy, but I didn't come up with it. I actually heard it from a priest at my local parish, so huge shout out to Father Dave for this piece of information.
Let's see what Father Dave's got.
When the disciples asked Jesus how to pray, he responded with something known as the Lord's Prayer, and one of the lines within the Lord's Prayer is, "Give us this day our daily bread." However, the Greek word that we translate to daily doesn't really mean daily.
Are you sure?
The Greek word epiousios is actually a word that was made up by the Gospel writers. It wasn't used in any other first century Greco-Roman writings. It's a combination of two words, epi and ousios. The first word, epi, means above, top, or super, and the second word, ousios, means nature, being, or essence. So when the Gospel says, "Give us this day our epiousios bread," it's saying, "Give us this day our supernatural bread."
So this is a fallacy known as the etymological fallacy, and it's based on the entirely false assumption that the meanings of words can be derived from their etymological origins, or in the case of compound words, the sum of the etymological origins of their constituent parts. So in the case of this compound word, you just look in a lexicon, look at the glosses for epi, and then look at the glosses for ousios, and then just pick and choose which glosses you want to stick together to create the meaning for this word. And that's absolutely not how language works. So you actually have to try to figure out how this word could be functioning in context by looking at other examples of the word ousia or ousios being used in similar constructions. And there are three different conclusions that scholars suggest are the three most plausible. One is that epiousios means upon being in the sense of for being, in order to be, in order to survive, necessary for existence. So give us the bread that is necessary to survive would be one way of interpreting this word. Now, another way to interpret it would be by looking at another phrase, epitin ousan, which is used to mean for today or today. Epitin ousan would be upon the being in the temporal sense of the current being, the current existing, the current day. So that phrase, which is very closely related to what we have in Matthew 6 and in Luke 11, suggests it might mean for today. Now, there's a third interpretation based on epiene, which would be upon to be in the sense of upon what is to be, what is to come, and so it could mean for the future. And so give us the bread for the future would be a third interpretation. So it's almost certainly one of those three, and nobody's really made a plausible case that it is anything other than one of those three. But the notion it means supernatural is definitely not it. That is just a blithe and sophomoric etymological fallacy.
To back up this claim, we can turn to the Latin Vulgate, an early translation of the Bible, which reads, "Panem nostrum supersubstantialem da nobis odie," or "Give us this day our supersubstantial bread."
So that is indeed the hyperliteral wooden rendering of this word that Jerome uses for Matthew 6. However, the exact same word is rendered differently in Luke 11:3. There it is rendered quotidianum, which means precisely daily. Now, Luke adds something to the Greek. We have the exact same Greek as Matthew, but then at the end, Luke adds to kathimeran, which means day by day or each day, which adds a little context to the idea of what exactly this bread is. That makes it much more likely that this word is to be understood as daily. Luke is saying, give us our daily bread each and every day. And so that is probably why Jerome went with daily in rendering the Greek word in Luke 11:3 rather than the rendering that he chose for Matthew 6, which again is hyperliteral, is wooden, is a bit of an etymological fallacy itself. But it is also coming a few hundred years after the composition of Matthew and Luke, when there's been plenty of time to develop a traditional interpretation of this word that did focus on its sacramental, Eucharistic significance. So Jerome is appealing to a tradition that was in vogue in that time period that understood this as a reference to the Eucharist. But there's not a scholarly case to make that the Greek of Matthew 6 or of Luke 11, when those texts were originally written, was actually focused on the Eucharist.
Now, we don't know exactly what Jesus said in the original Aramaic because the earliest copies of these scriptures that we have were written in Greek.
And also, we're not sure if this actually came from Jesus and if it actually came from Aramaic. I think it's plausible, but it's certainly not something that we can just presuppose.
But it's something along the lines of, give us this day our supernatural or divine bread. That's obviously a reference to the Eucharist, and if the Eucharist is divine, it means it's the real flesh and blood of Jesus Christ.
This is a linguistically sophomoric argument that is not particularly critical, is not particularly informed, and couldn't even be bothered to look at the Vulgate's rendering of Luke 11:3. So, in other words, this argument is pure and utter nonsense. And the fit for this video has been Lobo.